Welcome to another episode of our video series of the Philosophical History with Contemporary Critique.
Good morning. I'm doing great, thank you. Ready to get into a subject that is, well, fundamentally us, human language.
It really is, isn't it? Today we're launching into a really in-depth exploration of that very thing. How did it evolve? What makes it so unique, really, compared to anything else on Earth?
And what are the deep, maybe even frightening consequences it's had for our thought, for our societies?
Yeah.
I think our mission today is to look at these theories that argue human language is, well, maybe the most complex thing we've ever witnessed.
Okay.
We need to see how it measures up against, say, the best animal communication systems and, trace why we even needed it back to our own biology.
So the goal for you, listening, is to really get the foundational differences, the gap between our abstract way of signaling and other kinds of communication.
And to see why those specific differences were the real key, the prerequisite for civilization as we know it.
All right, so where do we start? The origin story.
Let's start there. The initial theories, they suggested language might have started with physical things. Gestures.
Oh, like pointing or throwing something.
Exactly. From an evolutionary standpoint, it's easier to explain a physical action than it is to explain complex vocal sounds, which take a lot of energy.
So the idea is movement came first, a physical cue, and then that sort of shifted over into the vocal domain.
Precisely. It's more efficient, frees up the hands, but that's just the mechanics. Whatever the origin, the final product.
Yeah.
Human language. It sets itself apart in a really dramatic way.
With two defining traits.
Two unique traits, yeah. And they combine to create this infinite potential.
The first one is productivity, right?
Productivity. It's this capacity for, well, infinite creation. You and I, right now, we could say a sentence that has never, ever been said before. Never written down, never indexed by Google.
And a fluent speaker would just get it instantly.
Instantly. It's an open-ended system, all built from just a finite set of sounds.
We're constantly inventing it without even realizing. So what about the second trait? The one that lets us escape the present?
That's displacement. The ability to talk about things that are not here, not in the here and now.
Like planning for retirement.
Or talking about theoretical physics.
Yeah.
For a long time, we thought these two things, infinite grammar and talking about the absent, were uniquely, exclusively human.
But to really get a handle on how special this is, we need something to compare it to.
Right, and that's where the bees come in.
A bee blueprint, a system that's supposedly simpler, but incredibly effective.
The honeybee colony is just.
Right.
It's a masterpiece of organization without a central command.
We finally cracked their code, right? The Waggle Dance.
We did.
Yeah.
And what's so amazing is its precision. It is pure information. It signals the distance to a flower patch,
Okay.
the direction relative to the sun's angle, and even how good the resource is, the quality. It's an incredibly high-fidelity data transfer.
It is. And what's funny is we house this data system in a metaphor that's completely wrong.
We do. We think of it like a monarchy or a military unit, with a queen barking orders.
But that's not it at all, is it? The research shows that's totally misleading. The queen, she's about population management, laying eggs.
That's her job. The actual complex decisions, like where to build a new nest, that's a highly democratic, decentralized process among the worker bees.
Wow.
The key thing to take away here is optimization. For the world a bee lives in, their signaling system is, frankly, flawless. They don't need to have abstract debates.
Why evolve the extra baggage?
Exactly. Why carry the biological burden of a complex language when a simple, precise vector for information works better for your survival?
So that brings us back to displacement. You've argued that talking about things that are absent isn't uniquely human.
I do, yeah. I think it's a bit of a misnomer. I mean, think about it. When a monkey gives an alarm call, it's signaling a danger that's coming, right?
Potential future state.
Exactly. It's not happening right now, but it might. So in a way, that's already displaced. That's not the real conceptual gap.
So if it's not just displacement, what is it? What's the real wall between our system and the bees?
This is the absolute heart of the matter. Bees can only signal information based on their firsthand experience. Meaning, a bee has to physically fly to the pollen, check it out, and then fly back to tell the others. They can't just pass on a message they heard from another bee. The source has to have been there.
Ah, I see. Whereas we can talk about things we have never, ever experienced ourselves.
That's the leap.
Yeah.
That is huge. We discuss history we didn't live through, Philosophical ideas like justice, scientific theories about things we can't see.
I can have a whole conversation about black holes without ever having been near one.
Precisely. And the consequences of that are immense. It's what allows us to build what are called imagined communities.
Nations, religions, corporations.
All of them. Social structures that depend entirely on us trusting and acting on stories that go way beyond our personal experience.
And this, of course, immediately opens the door for lying.
Yes. For falsehood. In the beehive, a lie about pollen doesn't work. The other bees go check, and the lie is exposed. The system self-corrects.
What with us?
With us, you can create a huge, complex narrative, a political ideology, a conspiracy theory that can't be immediately disproven by every single person's direct experience. It lets us have philosophy and art, but also shared delusions.
That ability to share things that aren't firsthand, it feels like a massive cognitive jump. Was it just a fluke, or did something biological force our hand?
There's a really powerful theory that links it directly to a huge evolutionary shift: bipedalism.
Walking on 2 feet.
Right. When our ancestors started walking upright, it changed everything. It put new constraints on the female pelvis, which meant the birth canal got narrower.
Which means we had to be born earlier. Our gestation period got cut short.
Exactly. A newborn chimp is already highly developed, motorically capable. A human baby is born in this pitiful, prolonged state of total dependency.
Our big brains had to get out before they were fully baked, basically.
You could put it that way, yes. And this sounds like a huge vulnerability. How did we survive it?
I was just about to ask.
It created a biological imperative. The long infancy meant we needed continuous cooperative care from the whole social group. Simple signals like danger or food just weren't going to cut it for raising a human child.
So standing up led to premature birth, which forced us into stronger social bonds.
Which then drove the development of more and more complex language and social structures. It's a complete feedback loop.
Language as a biological necessity, not a luxury.
A very strong case for it, yes. Yeah. And this then leads us to the question of thought. I mean, animals obviously think, they anticipate, they observe, they solve problems. But do they contemplate in the abstract?
We fall into the trap of anthropocentrism here, don't we? We assume if their thought doesn't look like our thought, which is so tied to language, then it's not really thought.
That's the trap. Philosophers have made this distinction. Animals engage in operative thinking, cognition, that's tied very tightly to the immediate sensory world, to getting a goal accomplished.
So a dog can figure out how to get a ball that rolled under the couch.
Absolutely. It can learn rules, anticipate a rabbit's path, memorize smells, but it doesn't lie awake at night regretting a decision it made 3 years ago. It doesn't plan its retirement.
Right, so a dog can figure out a door handle, but it's not gonna grasp the abstract concept of a house key.
Perfect analogy. A key is a purely symbolic tool that exists because of linguistic agreement, the ability to detach thought from the immediate sensory world. Language provides the scaffolding for that.
Okay, so if we have this system, how do we get it? Which brings us to that huge debate, innate versus learned, nature or nurture.
The way children acquire language is, well, it's miraculous. They go from just babbling to understanding incredibly complex sentences faster than any simple learning models can explain.
And that's the core argument for universal grammar, isn't it? The idea that the brain isn't a blank slate.
Exactly. Proponents argue we have an innate structure, a shared foundational grammar that guides how we learn. It's why kids make grammatical corrections for errors they've never been explicitly taught.
It suggests that the deep structures of language, of syntax, are biological.
Yes. The ability is programmed in, but the specific vocabulary, the sounds, that's what you learn from your environment.
But then you have the other side of the coin, linguistic relativity.
The Sapir-Whorf Hypothesis,
Yeah.
Which suggests basically the opposite, that the specific language you learn fundamentally shapes how you perceive and categorize the world. It's not just new labels, it's a whole new cognitive lens.
This idea was huge in the humanities, especially with postmodern critiques of a single, objective, central reason.
Of course.
Yeah.
Because if your language forces you to see the world differently, how can there be one objective reality? The famous example, though it's often a bit mythologized, is about words for snow.
The idea that Eskimo languages have dozens of words for it.
Right. And while the numbers got exaggerated, the principle is interesting. If your language gives you 20 distinct root concepts for snow, your perception of a winter landscape is just fundamentally different from someone who only has one word for it.
So the debate is, are we locked into that view, or does that universal grammar give us the key to learn a new way of seeing?
That's the tension that really defines a lot of modern linguistics.
Let's shift a little bit from the architecture of language to how we use it, its performance. There's this idea from drama, from Aristotle, that action is everything and language is secondary.
That's a common, but I think flawed reading. Yes, Aristotle says the mythos, the plot, the structure of the action is the soul of tragedy, but he doesn't dismiss language at all.
He calls it lexis.
Right, the diction, the choice of words. And he says it's profoundly important. The quality of the language is what elevates the story, what gives it its tragic weight. It's secondary to the action, sure, but it's absolutely indispensable.
And in our daily lives and communication, we often forget one of the most powerful tools we have.
Silence.
Silence.
So powerful, dramatically, but also intellectually. Think about a classroom. An impatient teacher asks a question, and when no one answers in 2 seconds, they just give the answer.
Right. And the students learn very quickly to just wait. Why expend the energy?
Exactly. Just wait. The professor will do the thinking for me. A good teacher uses silence. They ask the question, maybe write it on the board, and then they wait. That tension, that space, it allows everyone to engage their own brain.
And in a real conversation, true listening means not just waiting for your turn to talk.
It means actively not thinking about your own response. It's about absorbing what the other person is actually trying to say.
We also need to talk about language purity, standardization. This can get very political very fast.
It does. This strict adherence to, rigid spelling or grammar rules, what's sometimes called IMLA in standardization movements, is often used less for clear communication and more as a tool for social dominance.
A way to signal who's in and who's out.
It can be a small act of social aggression. People jump on a tiny error not because they didn't understand, but to establish a kind of hierarchy.
Which brings us to a principle of responsibility.
Clarity above purity, that's what I'd call it. When one person, a doctor, a scientist, an educator, has a responsibility to communicate something vital, they must use the language their listener understands best.
So using asymptomatic instead of symptomless when talking to a patient
is arguably irresponsible. It shifts the burden of understanding onto the person who is already vulnerable.
But on the other hand, you also have responsible language reform.
Oh, absolutely. We have to acknowledge that. Historically, targeted reforms have been incredibly successful, creating clear, vital terms in math and science. The coining of core Turkish terms like uzay for space or ishit for equal provided the tools for mass technical literacy. That's a huge success.
Which brings us to a final thought. If we're talking about true mastery of a language, what's the benchmark? It's not a test score.
No, I'd offer 2 metrics. 2 things that require real fluency, nuance, and deep cultural knowledge. First, the ability to tell a successful joke.
That's a high bar.
It is. You have to get the double meanings, the cultural context, the timing. It's operating on so many levels at once.
And the second one?
The ability to give a detailed cooking recipe.
That's a great one.
It requires mastering all that functional, action-based vocabulary, sprinkling, folding, kneading, stirring, that often trips up even very advanced learners. If you can make someone laugh and tell them how to cook dinner, you're fluent.
I love that. A brilliant measure. So ultimately, we've laid out that language is our gateway to everything abstract, to philosophy, to culture, but we have to end on its dual nature.
We do. It's the very tool that lets us escape the cage of the here and now. It lets us dream of utopias, but it also lets us feel regret, and is the constant source of our divisions.
Every time someone says, "This is my border,"
they're pointing to an idea, an abstract line created entirely by a shared linguistic story. You can't find it in the dirt.
So this power, this thing that lets us build civilizations, also gives us the framework for all our conflicts, our illusions.
It does. And that raises a profound question, one for you, the listener, to take away. Is this essential human tool, this thing that lets us escape the immediate world, is it ultimately a net positive? Or is it a constant source of existential delusion?
A wonderful and very destabilizing thought to end on. Thank you for this. It's been an essential analysis.
My pleasure.